What do we know about dreams and jokes and songs and religious experience? Can we explain that in terms of mechanisms? If we can, then we can make the leap and say, oh, I guess our old intuitions were just based on history and religion. Instead, let's look at the science. And the science says we can change our minds. We can go through a big conceptual change. We can go through a conceptual revolution, as science has always done. And we can have a different way of explaining how our conscious experience comes about.
So welcome everyone to today's interview, where I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Paul Thagard. He is Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of Waterloo and a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, the Cognitive Sciences Society, and the Association for Psychological Science. His work focuses on cognitive science, philosophy of mind, philosophy of science and medicine, and he's published many books and many articles, and but just to name a few, he has Coherence in Thought and Action, Hot Thought Mechanisms and Applications of Emotional Cognition, The Brain and the Meaning of Life, and his new book that we'll be covering today, Dreams, Jokes, and Songs, How Brains Build Consciousness. Feel free to add anything, but with that, welcome in, and thanks so much for being here, Professor Thagard.
Oh, thanks very much for the conversation.
Yeah, so as I said, we're going to be covering your new book. At the time of recording, it's not out, but I think by the time this is published, it should be, or at least it's not out in hardcover. I'm not sure.
Actually, it's out in England, but it won't be out in North America until the end of September.
Okay, fair enough. Yeah, I think I remember seeing it being like September 30th or something like that for North America. But if it's out already in England, fair enough. But yeah, the book's called Dreams, Jokes, and Songs, How Brains Build Consciousness. And so just as a sort of start, you mind giving maybe a brief introduction to this book? What are some of the key issues that you cover, and why might someone want to check it out?
Well, the problem of consciousness is one of the most difficult in all of philosophy and science, because it seems that our experiences, and we've got such a huge round of them, aren't really accessible to scientific explanation. So lots of philosophers have thought, well, that shows that materialism, the scientific approach to explaining things, is inherently limited because we can't explain why we feel different kinds of things, such as our sensations, our perceptions, our emotions, or even abstract thoughts like thinking about philosophy. So that seemed something that wasn't within the range of neuroscientific explanations. Now, for the last 30, 40, 50 years, I've been developing computational and cognitive explanations for a lot of these things, lots of different kinds of reasoning, discovery, creativity, and consciousness just seems maybe it can't be gotten to. And certainly lots of people have tried to argue to that end. But it's a big problem, but I think it's now accessible. We now know enough about how the brain works, specifically what brain mechanisms are responsible for consciousness, that we can make a case for it. So I argue that there are 4 brain mechanisms that are jointly sufficient to explain all kinds of consciousness. The 4 brain mechanisms are, first of all, neural representation. So if you want, I can say more about what that is, but basically our neurons fire and they can represent things in the world. But that's not enough, because we got to go into the details of how that works. So another crucial idea is binding. So suppose this is one neural representation and this is another neural representation. I'm kind of using my fingers to represent the firing pattern of different neurons. So maybe this is red and this one is square. Well, how do we put red and square together? That requires binding. But we can now have a good explanation of how binding works. We can take different representations and put them together to make more complicated ones. But that's not enough. We also need an idea of competition, because consciousness is very selective. We can't think of all the different things constantly, because right now I could be thinking about my walk this morning, the work I was doing, the baseball game that I'm going to watch tonight. So there's all these different sorts of things, but consciousness is very selective. And the way you explain this selectivity is competition. So you've got these different neural representations. You can think of this is one representation, this is another, and they can be competing with each other. And that can also be explained mechanistically. The additional mechanism I think that's really needed, and this is probably the most original part of the current theory, is that our consciousness has to make sense of things. There's a lot of complexity in the things that we see. To imagine, for example, a picture of Taylor Swift wearing a red shirt. Well, you have to put that together and make sense of it. And the way you do that is a mechanism of coherence. So my general argument is if you have these four mechanisms, neural representation, binding, coherence, and competition, you can explain all the aspects of conscious experience. So that's an audacious claim, but in the book, I defend it by showing that it applies really well to lots of different high-level applications.
Awesome. Yeah, that's a great overview, and I do want to get more into those four conditions, and then how we get from there to a sort of recurring emergence of those, and so on. But I did want to first note that one thing that you mentioned in the book as well. A lot of philosophers, when talking about consciousness, use like the term qualia, sort of standard terminology, but you take certain issue with it, and you have your preferred terminology like Zing and so on. I mean, do you mind just talking just briefly about how you think about the term qualia and like how you prefer to think about consciousness and so on?
I'm perfectly happy with the description qualitative experience, because there are some things that seem really special about consciousness. One is that it seems to be private because I have my own conscious experiences. I don't have yours, but it's qualitative. What that means isn't obvious, but it's definitely something that's going on there. And so we need to try to explain it. I mean, one tack that's been taken by some psychologists like behaviorists and some philosophers is to just say, oh, we can ignore it. We can say this is an illusion. This is just a mistake. I don't think that's true. I don't know about you, but I have hundreds or thousands of conscious experiences every day because I have perceptions, I have sensations like pain or feeling hungry. I've also got emotions. We have hundreds of different kinds of emotions. Sometimes, since I'm a philosopher, I have very abstract kinds of conceptions as well, like wondering about consciousness. So every one of us has these hundreds or thousands of experiences every day. And it's okay to call them qualitative, but I don't like the notion of qualia, because it was introduced by philosophers basically to make this look like it was impossible. These are people who are motivated to think that experience is so special that it couldn't be explained at all by scientific means, that neuroscience was irrelevant because you'd never get at the qualitative nature of what they summed up as qualia. So I don't like qualia because it makes it sound like there's things, but these aren't things. Experiences aren't things. What they are is processes. So it's a process in my psychological experience. And I think that the evidence is now mounting that it's a neurological kind of process. It's something that the brain is doing that's causing it. So because the term qualia has been used more to obscure than to clarify, I just as soon not use it. I've one of the chapters on the books that I think is the most fun is the one on dreams. And some people claim that dreams are really creative. Since I started working on the book several years ago, I've been tracking my dreams, and all that time I only had one creative dream. And the most creative dream was I got the idea that I should call these qualitative experiences Zing. I thought, hey, that's kind of good. It's sort of neutral. It's unfamiliar. I probably got it from a song that I like called Zing Goes the Strings of My Heart. So Zing was a sort of neutral term, and I want to be able to explain qualitative experience or the zing of experience in a full way that doesn't make consciousness go away, that doesn't deny that it exists, that doesn't claim it's an illusion, takes it very seriously, but says that if we have a rich enough neural theory, we can explain all these characteristics of consciousness, including the zing or the qualitative experience we have.
Yeah, good. I mean, I suppose the term qualia, like I know there's some people, like I previously talked with Keith Frankish, and he's an illusionist, but like I think he's really only illusionist about qualia because, well, he takes qualia in this really robust sense, which he doesn't think is real, like something like, well, it's like really metaphysically private, resists any sort of reduction or identification with the physical stuff going on. Like, I mean,
well, I think that's just unduly pessimistic, because the fact that it hasn't been explained yet when cognitive neuroscience is only a few decades old is no reason to suppose it doesn't exist. We have to keep the effort going. And lots of people in neuroscience and in psychology and in philosophy have taken up that challenge. Let's explain it. Let's not deny it. So illusionism, I think, is just giving up in a way that's totally unnecessary. It's as if people in Middle Ages have said, oh, we'll never explain life, which of course biology has managed to do really well, or we'll never explain why objects fall, which physics of course did very well. And so it can take a long time, but in the last few decades, there's been such dramatic progress in neuroscience and neuroscientific psychology that it's way too soon to give up. What I'd rather do, which I've tried to do, which is in fact explain it, show how it can work. And I think my four mechanisms do a really good job of that.
Yeah, no, but also just like, I mean, I think some people are illusionists or eliminativists with respect to a certain conception of qualia. If they took some really robust sense of, maybe mysterious sense of what that is supposed to be, then, well, okay, maybe we don't have that, right? But we still have, like, I don't know, I have visual experiences. I hear things, I feel things, I have introspect and so on. I don't think it's sort of built, some of these more robust things that we might think don't exist aren't built into that, like by default, right? Is what I would say anyway. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Well, I guess if you define qualia as a mystery, then I want to get rid of it. But what I'd rather do is to not talk generally, but to look specifically. And another way that philosophers often talk about consciousness is there's something that it's like. This goes back to Nagel. And I think that's really misleading, because there's not something that it's like to be conscious. There are thousands of things that it's like to be conscious. We have 5 different external senses. We've got at least a dozen internal senses, including things like balance. And we've got hundreds of different emotions. And we've got an unlimited number of abstract consciousness things, because we've got all the different concepts. People probably have 100,000 different concepts that they can be aware of. So there are thousands and thousands of things that it's like to be conscious. And the goal of, I think, philosophy and psychology and neuroscience is to explain all of these. And I think we can, if we find the right mechanisms. And that's why I make the case that if you look at really interesting phenomena, not just visual experience, which is what consciousness researchers usually talk about, and that's important, but it's only one of dozens or hundreds of different kinds of experiences. We should have a theory that explains all of those. And I think that the 4 mechanisms, what I call the NBC theory of consciousness, because that's short for neural representation, binding, coherence, and competition, I think that theory can actually do the job. At that point, we don't have to think that consciousness is something imaginary or we're mistaken about or unscientific, because we can explain it scientifically using neural mechanisms.
Good. So I guess we could just get a little bit more in detail on those 4 mechanisms, maybe starting with neural representation there. So yeah, so this sort of gets at the fact that there's patterns of neural firings and a way these sort of encode or track perceptions, sensations, like emotions, that sort of thing. I don't know, maybe, is that right? Maybe you could expand on this and why this is important.
Sure. So let me give you a simple introduction to what a neural representation is, because this is a relatively new idea. The idea of representation has been around probably since the ancient Greeks. A representation is just something that stands for something else. And the representations we're most familiar with are words. So when I use the word dog, it stands for dogs in the world. Or I can also make a picture of the dog. It could be a picture that I draw or a mental picture, but these are representations. So the question is, how does the brain do this? Assuming that the brain does it, what else would do it? It could be the soul, but there's no evidence for the existence of souls. So there's lots of reasons to believe that it's the brain that's doing our thinking, and it does it by representations. So how do you get a representation of a dog? Well, let's take it down to the simplest level. I'll use one finger to mean one neuron. So it could be that one neuron can stand for dog, but in fact, it's much more complicated than that. There may be a dog neuron that fires just when you see dogs. Some people say there's a Jennifer Aniston neuron that fires when you think about Jennifer Aniston, but usually it's much more complicated than that. So instead of thinking of one neuron, let's think of 5 neurons. Each of my finger is a neuron. And so I make a neural representation, and it's going to be a pattern of firing of these neurons. But the number of patterns, even with 5 neurons, is really huge, because it's not just whether they're firing or they're not firing. It's also the temporal pattern with which they're firing. Are they all firing fast or slow? A neuron typically can fire about 100 times a minute. And so if you've got each of these neurons capable of doing 100 times a minute, I mean, that actually grows really rapidly. The combinatorics are wonderful. And so even with 5 neurons, you can do something really complicated. But that's not going to be enough probably to represent dog, because there's a lot of features of dog, what they look like, what they do, that they're mammals and so on. So let's suppose that instead of just having 5 neurons, we've got what we know to be true, 86 billion neurons. So if you've got 86 billion neurons that are capable of firing 100 times a second, the number of combinatoric combinations are just absolutely astonishing. So there's a huge representational power there. So the claim here is that a neural representation of dog is a pattern of firing among the 86 billion neurons that are in your brain. It's not going to be all those neurons because some of them are doing basic things like breathing but still you've got billions of neurons that could have a firing pattern that could represent dog. And so it's very easy to take the 100,000 concepts or so that we've got and all these different sorts of experiences and imagine that neural representation is involved in all of them.
Right. Yeah. I could see someone having the worry that when you talk about representation here, do you have more worked out account of representation? Like, I don't know, because it sounds like, is it something more intentional? Like, because you might worry that you're smuggling in something more theory laden already. I mean, do you see what I'm saying here? Like, what do you think?
Oh, no, this is highly theoretical, but there's lots of evidence for it. So there's lots of psychological evidence that when people are having experiences, there are patterns of firing in their brain. But the mathematics are well worked out because we've developed all these computational models of neural networks where you have to figure out mathematical formulas that describe how neurons make each other fire, how they excite each other, how they inhibit each other. And then you can do it even for very large neural networks with millions or billions. Well, actually, than billions, but with millions of different neurons. So computational neuroscience has stepped in to build up the mathematics of how this works. And so we've got a pretty good idea of how a whole bunch of neurons can work together by exciting and inhibiting each other, and then have that connected with the world. How does it connect with the world? Well, it's because of our senses. So your eyes are interacting with the world causally because there's light bouncing off things into our eyes. And it's really well understood now after 100 years of neuroscience how this actually works. So the way I've developed my concept of dog is partly by seeing dogs, because I've seen lots of dogs and had this kind of causal interaction with them, but also by learning other things about them, such that they're mammals and what their organs are like and the sort of things that they can do. So we put it all together. It's, I think, well founded to say that our knowledge of dogs is captured by all these patterns of neural firing that are capable of representing all of our knowledge about dogs.
Right. So is the primary mechanism here for neural representation, it's sort of like causal and correlational? Like, I don't know. Do you have a further account of what a representation is more generally, or?
Well, I want it to be causal rather than correlational. So when in the case where you're seeing a dog, then you've got a causal process where light bounces off the dog, goes into your eyes, stimulates your retina, sends a signal to the back of your brain where visual processing goes on. So that's entirely causal. But we can also extrapolate beyond that to cases where you develop an abstract concept of a dog and are able to make reasoning, such as all dogs have fur, that's a dog, so it has fur. So we can do that more abstract things as well.
Right, fair enough. Okay.
So I don't want to just talk about, some neuroscientists like to talk about the neural correlates. Well, I think that's way too weak. I think that was fine decades ago. But now we don't have to talk just about correlates. We can give a causal theory of what's going on in the brain that can give a causal explanation of why we have the thoughts and experiences we do. We've really moved beyond correlates to causal explanations, which is, I think, a much more desirable goal of scientific explanation.
Right. That's a good point. And I do have a question I'm going to get to that kind of relates to that a bit more. But for now, I guess we could just move on to the second feature there, binding. And this is sort of just the combination of separate representations into like compounds, like more complex representations, maybe. So you can go ahead on that if you want.
Yeah, so the importance of binding was recognized by psychologists and philosophers for many different directions. One was in perception. So decades ago, and Treisman recognized that there's a binding problem. That is, when you perceive something, it's not a hodgepodge. So when I see a picture of you in the screen there, it's not just disconnected things. I can see your shirt, I can see your hair, I can see your face, and we bind that together into a whole. So that's how binding appeared in perception. But way back, much longer, way back in the 18th century, philosophers started to realize that, well, this is important for creativity. How do we do things that go beyond our immediate perceptions? And going back to all those old ideas, Scottish philosophers, they realized that we can explain creativity by taking representations that are already there and binding them into new things. So I've got one paper where I showed that the 200 greatest discoveries in scientific and technology are all based on taking existing ideas and binding them into something new. So where do you get the concept of an atom from? Well, it's a particle and it's small and invisible. So you've got small invisible particle. Suddenly you have the concept of atom, which has turned out to be fundamental in physics and chemistry and biology. So for both creativity but also for mundane perception, the notion of binding is really crucial. Now, how does binding work? Well, this shouldn't just be a metaphor. The neural representation isn't a metaphor anymore because we've got these really detailed computational models of how it works. Well, binding isn't a metaphor anymore either because we can say how the combination works. In fact, there are two good theories, neural theories of how binding works. The simplest one is just synchrony. So suppose this is one representation, this is another representation. How do I bind them together? The synchrony theory says, it's because they get temporally coordinated. They basically get synchronized. So that's one good theory. I think it explains some simple kinds of binding, such as what happens in perception. So if you see Taylor Swift in a red dress, you've got the dress and you've got the red, and basically the neurons that represent that are synchronized with each other, just like a band gets synchronized. And that's the binding by neural synchrony. But there's a more complicated idea, computational neuroscientists, that is, I think, really powerful too. And it's called, I momentarily lost the name for it. It starts with C. I'll come back to that. But the idea here is instead of just having synchrony, you can actually convolve them. Yeah, convolution is the word. So you can convolve them mathematically. Now, the mathematics of this has really worked out, but it takes vector algebra, and I don't think this is the time to explain vector algebra. But the math is well understood. The computational models are developed, especially by my colleague, Chris Eliasmith. And so convolution allows you to take the different representations and put them together, describe it mathematically with full rigor, implement in computer programs, and it's been very widely used. So I think we don't have to choose between the synchrony view of binding and the convolution view. I think they're both valuable. And there probably are other mechanisms of binding that haven't been discovered yet. The key thing is we can understand binding, taking different things and putting them together as neural representations, not as a metaphor, but actually as a computational mechanism that can work in real brains that can explain how our complicated experiences come about. Because my experience of a red dress can't be just red over there and dress over there. It's got to be put together. And it's the binding mechanism by synchrony or convolution that explains how we do that.
Right. Yeah. And I recall you discussing we should have an account that explains the sort of unity or unified aspects of experiencing consciousness. And so binding is part of the story there about how you get that, not just a bunch of disparate, separate representations, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's not what James called the blooming, buzzy confusion. You actually put it together. So binding is part of that, but you also need another mechanism. And this is probably the most original theory aspect of my theory of consciousness, which is you need coherence. That is, you need to make sense of it. And here, I've really got a new take on coherence compared to what's happened in philosophy. Coherence has been an important idea in philosophy going back to Hegel and the British idealists. In the 20th century, it was important because of writings by people like Wilfrid Sellars and Gilbert Harman. But probably the best idea I've had in a very long career was realizing that it was possible to make coherence into a very well-specified mechanism by drawing on ideas from neural networks. So this is back in the 80s when neural networks were just starting to be recognized. I realized that instead of taking coherence as something like consistency, but a broader thing that involves fuzzy ideas like hanging together or fitting together, we can make it very precise by understanding it in terms of what neural network theorists have called constraint satisfaction. So you've got a whole bunch of different things going on. If I'm trying to make sense of a complex thing. So it's not just a dog in my backyard. It's a dog that looks like it's chasing a squirrel. I got to put it all together into a coherent package. And the idea of coherence as constraint satisfaction turns this from a metaphor into a mechanism. because the different constraints you have, some things fit together, other things don't fit together. You can actually represent by a neural network where the excitatory and the inhibitory functions of the neurons corresponds to what fits together and what doesn't. And so the mathematics of this is very elegant. It's been worked out. Theorems have been proved about it. And loads of computational models have been developed. So when I say that coherence is a mechanism, I'm not talking about the sort of loose idea of things kind of fit together or not. I'm talking about something very precise about how you can get a neural network, or other algorithms for that matter, to be able to figure out what fits together, what doesn't fit together, and it can make sense of very complex things, such as the dog chasing the squirrel in my backyard. So coherence is really important for understanding what's going on. It enables us to make complicated pictures of what we see, but it's also really important for emotions. So in order to have a theory of consciousness, you have to have a theory of emotions. Fortunately, I've got a theory of emotions that I've developed over the last decade or so. It's been published in serious journals. So here's the idea of, there have been debates about what emotions are. Some people say, oh, it's an appraisal. It's a judgment about how you're doing with respect to your goals. And other people say, oh, no, that's not what it is. Emotions are, in fact, things going on in your body. You're basically reacting to your bodily changes with your heart rate and your hormonal rates and so on. Well, if you take a neural approach to this, a neural mechanism approach, you can put these together. So on my theory, an emotion is a combination of three things. First of all, you have to represent the situation because your emotion is about something. So I'm happy that it's Friday afternoon while the situation is it's Friday afternoon. But you also have to have the changes going on in your body. William James was right about that. But that's not incompatible with saying, oh, you also have to have appraisals. You're figuring out, how is this relevant to my goals? So if you've got the same three things, that is, if you've got representation of the situation, representation of what's going on in my body, and appraisal of what's going on, and then you put them together, then you get something that's quite coherent. You've got to have a fit between what's happening in my body and the appraisal, which is really a complicated kind of coherence, because in complicated situations, you've got some things are going well, other things not going so well. And so you have to make an overall evaluation of how your goals are being satisfied. But you put this all together, and we know how to put them together in neural networks because we built the computational models of it, then you get a view of emotion that isn't just appraisal, isn't just what's happening in your body. Rather, it's your brain putting together a coherent interpretation of all of that. So by a combination of binding and coherence, you're making sense of the world, and we can explain this vast array of emotional experiences that we have.
Awesome. Yeah, there's definitely a few things that I want to ask about there. Maybe we'll just bring up a couple. But first of all, when you think about emotions there, is it sort of necessary for all emotions that they're about things? Because I don't know. I think there's some people who think that you can just have a general sense of pleasure or something, but it's not really about something else. I mean, what do you think? Is that?
Yeah, there's a value between
yeah,
emotions and moods. So I think emotions are all, but moods are much more subtle. They're kind of low level sort of things. So they don't have to be out the same way. That could just be the result of having, say, generally positive emotions or generally negative emotions if you're in a bad mood. Yeah, so you're right that in those cases, that mood is a more long lasting and less representational, but it still is going to involve a combination of background appraisals, so things are going well or they're not, but also what's happening in your body, because the body is an important part of emotions.
Good. Yeah, that makes sense. And then there's something else I was going to say there. Yeah, so I don't know. This makes a lot of sense to me. Like, I don't know. I'm thinking about, well, one thing that the brain definitely does is it helps to, well, it tries to limit sort of surprise, get a good model of the world around us. And I take it that coherence is doing something like that. It's like making sense of the sensory inputs in a way.
Yeah, it's doing that.
Kind of constructing a coherent model.
But it's doing all these different things. It's making sense of our inputs, but it's also making sense of what's going on in our body. And it's making sense based partly on past experience. And so it's not just prediction. There's a theory that consciousness results from prediction, but I don't think that's true. It involves lots of the other ways in which we're making sense of the world, because there are many things that the brain does besides prediction.
Right. But that's part of it anyway.
Part of it.
Yeah. Right. And then the fourth thing is the competition process there, which is like, as you sort of mentioned already briefly, that it's sort of like intention or attention selection among kind of different neural representations based on different.
Competition is the mechanism that explains attention. Attention is a crucial part of it. Everyone knows about the cocktail party phenomenon. You're at a cocktail party talking to somebody and you think you're focusing on them, but then somebody on the other side of the room mentions your name, and then your consciousness just switches over. The same thing would happen right now. Right now, I'm fully concentrating on you and the computer, but if a bird crashed through my window, my consciousness would flip variants, my attention would shift. But this is not original to me. There's many psychologists have suggested that the way that attention works is not just a metaphor, it's actually a mechanism, and the mechanism is competition. And we have a really good idea of how competition works in the brain because you got one pattern of firing, another pattern of firing, and they're inhibiting each other. Because one neuron inhibits another, when one neuron's firing, it slows the firing in the other. So if you got different neural representations that can compete with each other by inhibition, then you get a really good explanation of attention.
Yeah, that's good. I recall Dan Dennett had this notion about fame in the brain or something, and I feel like this is putting a little bit more of a neurological basis to something like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, Dennett wrote a lovely book decades ago about consciousness, but it had a number of problems. One big problem is it's all metaphorical. He tried to explain it in terms of various things like
theaters and
fame in the brain. Yeah. So that was okay for a few decades back. But the way science often operates, and this has been true of physics, chemistry, and biology, and lots of psychology as well, is it starts with metaphors because we're just trying to explain things in terms of what we already know. But as science develops, metaphors get developed into or sometimes are replaced by mechanisms. Cases where you can say, here are the parts, here are the interactions. Because of their interactions, we get certain causal results. And there we make the advance from metaphorical description to causal mechanisms. And I think what's wonderful is we're reaching that stage now for consciousness as well.
Right. And so, great. So now that we have, at least briefly, these four aspects here, how do we get from there to consciousness? Or why think that, maybe this is a better way to put it, why think that these sort of things and maybe the ongoing interplay and recurrence of these things is what results in some sense in experience and consciousness?
Yeah, that's a great question. So you got to fill in the gap. What you don't want is, there's a famous cartoon that shows a bunch of mathematicians or physicists sitting around drawing equations on a blackboard, and on the blackboard it says, and then a miracle occurs. You don't want any miracles. So we got to fill in the gaps. So what do? Well, first of all, you need to show that these four mechanisms are in fact capable of providing causal explanations of lots of different aspects of consciousness. So I don't just talk about vision the way people often do. What I do is, first of all, show that these apply to the four kinds of consciousness. What are they? There's the perceptions like seeing, there's sensations like pain and hunger, and emotions. I use the example of loneliness, and these abstract thoughts. In this case, I use the self. So I can't do it all of it because I didn't want the book to be 5,000 pages long, but I picked one of each. And I picked unusual ones. So for the case of perception, I picked smell. So I show how these four mechanisms can explain smell. And then I do the same thing for sensation. And there I picked hunger because it's not often talked about. People should talk about pain. It should apply there too, and it will. But I picked hunger because it's usually ignored. And then for the emotions, I picked loneliness because that's a really object of concern these days, loneliness. So I wanted to be able to explain that fairly complicated kind of emotion. And then for abstract thought, I picked the self because people think about themselves, and probably a lot of animals can't, but we can. And so first of all, you need to show that it applies to these four. But then I wanted to go after examples that were really complicated and really juicy. And that's why I talked about dreams. And one of the things I found when I started looking at dreams is there are no good current theories of dreams. I reviewed the literature, it took me about a month, and realized all those theories are bad. They're bad about what dreams are for. They're bad about how they work in the brain. And if you take the four mechanisms and put it together. It was actually thinking about dreams that made me think that coherence was relevant. If you include coherence in it, you can give an account of dreams much better than any of the previous ones. And then I did the same thing for jokes. So I spent a month reviewing the current theories of jokes, realized none of them are very good. But if you put together neural representation, binding, coherence, and competition, you can explain why jokes are funny, why some jokes are funny, where the others fall flat. And then I did musical experience, just because I love music. I spend 8 hours a day listening to music. And so I wanted to know where that comes from. And my theory worked really well for that. And just to fit, I could have kept on doing this for 20 years, but I wrapped it up by looking at other things that I thought were really interesting, religious experience and what goes on in sports, and a couple of other examples that I think are, and moral judgments. So first of all, you need to show that the theory really does have a lot of explanatory power, because it's not just visual experience. It can give the details of how all these different sorts of wonderful human experiences work. So that's the first step. The second step, and now is where it gets harder. That was pretty easy to do, because I could show the relevance of neural representation, binding, coherence, and competition to each of these. But then how do you make the leap? Now, this is the big problem in consciousness that everyone worries about. How do you get to the qualitative aspect of experience? And here, I think the really crucial idea to bring in is emergence. Now, by emergence, I mean something much more than, and then a miracle occurs, because emergence is not a miracle. We can get a really good idea of how emergence works by looking at much simpler examples, things that are really well understood. So take the simplest sort of thing you could want. What happens if you've got a hydrogen atom and an oxygen atom, or two hydrogen atoms and an oxygen atom, and you manage to combine them? Well, you get water. And water has properties that are not found in hydrogen or oxygen alone. It has different properties. It's hydrogen and oxygen are gases, but H2O, water, is liquid at room temperature. So it's a really simple example of emergence, and you can identify dozens of such examples all through the sciences. So how do you get life? Well, life isn't a magic thing. It isn't a magic property. It's the result of interactions of a whole bunch of different biological mechanisms, such as respiration and digestion and cell division and nervous systems. You go on and on. So that's how you get life. So I think the same thing is going to be true of consciousness. So you have to figure out what kinds of interactions produce it. So what I try to show in as much detail as I can, it's not a full story yet, but that's going to take a while, probably decades or centuries to work out. But if you have the interactions between neural representation and binding and coherence and competition, these four mechanisms that we've got reason to operate in everything from dreams to religious experience, then we could explain that our qualitative experiences come from that. Now, you can't just say that. You have to work it out in a lot of detail, but I do work it out in a lot of detail. I have to explain how we get coherence, how we sometimes get incoherence, and we can see how particular qualitative aspects come about from particular kinds of neural representations, coherence, binding, and competition. So it's not the whole story yet. I mean, the tale of mechanisms in the history of science is always very long. It took a long time to get from natural selection and evolution all the way up to be able to explain the evolution of species at a really detailed level. But Darwin identified a couple of the key mechanisms, and people later on figured out genetics and other aspects, DNA, that fill in the gaps. So there's still some gaps here, but I think the general picture that these four mechanisms can interact with each other and produce the emergent properties of consciousness is quite plausible.
Good. I did want to ask a little bit on this notion of emergence that you use here in the book. How sort of robust is that notion? I think you would commit to there being this sort of like structure or layers to reality in a sense. I mean, is that something you would commit to? And there's sort of emergence between the layers, or the relations of fundamentality between the layers, or is that? Yeah.
Yeah, well, there's bigger and smaller things. You can go down to subatomic particles, to atoms, to molecules, to cells, to biological systems, up to organisms. Yeah, so there's all those layers. And that correlates quite strongly with the emergence, because you can have things down at the lower level and then properties emerge at the higher level, in the same way that a neuron is basically just a cell, which is a bunch of chemicals or a bunch of proteins and other chemicals, but they interact in the way that give the cell its property and its ability to fire and stimulate or inhibit other neurons.
Okay, good. Yeah, because you mentioned there being bigger or smaller things, and then there's going to be different relations between them, meteorological and so on. That seems all fine to me. And I bring this up because some people talk about emergence and the sort of hierarchies as, something more metaphysical or something more robust that I take some issue with, but I'm not sure that you would.
I think this is robust, but I don't think it's metaphysical. But it's metaphysical in the good kind of metaphysics, and it's based on science. We know pretty well how molecules can interact to produce chemical reactions inside cells, and cells can interact to produce things that go on in organisms and build up. You never know the whole story, but a lot of that has been worked out in quite a lot of detail. Here, obviously, there still is a bunch to be worked out, because specifically how the four neural mechanisms interact to produce your particular emotion at this moment, if you're feeling happy or sad or whatever, there's lots of details still to be worked out. But I think the general picture is becoming clear, and few further research should be able to fill that in.
Fair enough. Also, now you mentioned these four conditions, but might there be more? Why think it's just these four, and maybe because certainly there's more neurological processes that go on. Why is it just these ones, do you think?
Oh, you're absolutely right. There could be additional mechanisms that you need, but I was looking for the core four, the ones that we're going to be able to do most of the explanatory power. So if you can explain everything about a consciousness with just these four, then that's all they need for a theory. There may be other things that I haven't thought of that would be relevant. I don't think you can get rid of any of these. If you don't have neural representation, then you can't explain how we have such a wide variety of experiences. The fact that we've got all the billions of combinations of neural firings explain why we can have all our different kinds of perceptions, sensations, emotions, and so on. So we need neural representation. We need binding, because you have to be able to get the more complicated kinds of experiences. We need coherence, because that is what's going on when we're making sense of a really complex situation, when we're trying to figure out what the hell does our dream mean, for example? And so you come up with weird experiences. And you need competition because of the intentional aspect of consciousness. So we certainly need those four. There may be an additional mechanism that simply haven't realized yet. But how do you know that those four are good? Well, because they explain perception, sensations, emotions, abstract thought, dreams, jokes, religious experience, and so on. So it's the fact that these four working together can explain so much gives us some reason to think that, yes, that's probably the basis for consciousness.
Fair enough. Yeah, it feels like maybe there's something more, or maybe there's something that you need to explain certain phenomena. But it feels like if your argument's right here, or your case is right here, that maybe everything is covered already by these four. Maybe we don't need any more.
Well, I hope so, but I wouldn't be shocked. And each of those can be developed. I mentioned, for example, with binding, we've got two good ideas about what the neural mechanisms are. We've got the synchrony idea and the convolution idea. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if it turns out that the brain finds other ways to combine neural representations as well. And that would be really interesting. Yeah, there's loads of room for progress here.
Right. And I did want to bring up, you sort of covered this in passing already a little bit, but one worry that I think a fair amount of people might have to this is that, look, you've here described various, kind of structural features, or features that our brains have that are maybe similar to certain features that our minds have, that certain mental features, but that's not enough for identity. Maybe these are just more correlates of consciousness, but without identity or reduction or something like that. I think this is something you discuss in the book.
So how do you make the leap?
You could cover that.
Yeah. So the question is, how do you make the leap from correlates to identity? I think that's a really good question. Why don't we think that, well, hydrogen and oxygen correlate with water, but why suppose there's an identity there? Well, because of the evidence. That is, we can explain everything that we know about water by realizing that it's made up of hydrogen and oxygen combined into a molecule with emergent properties. So the hypothesis that water, the identity that water is H2O, has just huge explanatory power. Similarly, the fact that I can explain lots of different aspects of our full range of conscious experience with these four mechanisms suggests, oh, no, it's not just a correlate. It's actually that causal explanation of why this sort of thing goes on. So we make the leap from correlates to identity when our causal explanations are good enough.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I could see someone like, look, I mean, we have correlations between like heat and mean molecular motion or something like that, but like we think that there's a good reason to posit an identity there. Like heat is mean molecular motion on some level. But I could see someone pushing back and saying, well, there's a difference between these cases, which is that in the case of water and H2O, like we can realize that the stuff, the chemical structure of this liquid in front of us that we're calling water actually is some H2O. It's not merely a correlation. And maybe something similar with other like a posteriori identities. But maybe it's less plausible that we could use something like that in the case of like brain processes and consciousness. Do you see the sort of worry that some?
Well, it doesn't seem impossible to people because they've got preconceived views. They've got the preconceived view. Oh, mind has to be something special, and where does that come from? Well, part of it, of course, comes from religion. Religions, most people are dualists. That is, most people belong to religions like Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism that believe we have life after death. And in order to believe in life after death, then we have to have something special called a soul. And so if that's where your intuitions come from, then of course this has got to be wrong. And even if you're not religious, a lot of the intuitions carry over from these religious views that have dominated human thinking for thousands of years. And so we've got these intuitions that come from this long historical record of believing that the soul is something special. Science challenges that. Darwin challenged that. Newton challenged a lot of ideas that came from religion as well, even though he was religious himself. But now cognitive neuroscience has reached the point where we can challenge this really fundamental dogma that there's something special about mind. And so your intuitions here are useless. Intuitions that philosophers rely on, I think, are mostly just prejudices. And so you can't rely on that at all. What we can do is try to think, what are the facts? What do we know about these different sorts of things? What do we know about dreams and jokes and songs and religious experience? Can we explain that in terms of mechanisms? If we can, then we can make the leap and say, oh, I guess our old intuitions were just based on history and religion. Instead, let's look at the science. And the science says we can change our minds. We can go through a big conceptual change. We can go through a conceptual revolution, as science has always done. And we can have a different way of explaining how our conscious experience comes about. So forget about the old intuitions. Look at the explanations that are provided by these four mechanisms in lots of really rich areas of consciousness.
Good. Yeah, I kind of think that, like, look, if the sort of more a priori arguments against the materialism or the sort of view fail, then, like, I don't know. I mean, we might have reason to think that, based on the success of the science or what the science seems to indicate, that mental stuff is on some level something going on in our heads, and we might develop a successful account like what you've given here, as you argue, and that might further bolster that sort of perspective, and not, having to appeal to something like a soul intervening at some point or something like that.
The soul is a miracle, and nothing I've described here, these neural mechanisms, there's really good evidence to believe that each of them is operating in our brains, and so this is a totally no miracle approach to explaining where our conscious experiences come from. Right.
Yeah. So another thing you've talked about a little bit already, but in the book you talk about one of the advantages of your approach over, and you discuss some of the alternatives, is it's just this explanatory breadth. It just covers a wide range of phenomena, like from more basic experiences and emotions and so on to more complex or compound things, and like dreams, jokes, and songs, and so on, as the title goes. And so maybe if you could talk a little bit about how your approach is sort of more suited to cover this wide range of phenomena than some of the other approaches, like maybe integrated information theory. So,
Well, you have to look at particular example. So why don't we take dreams, for example? Because everybody dreams, right? Everybody goes to sleep at night, and sleep is an incredibly valuable biological process. It restores your body and it restores your brain. So a lot of things going on in your brain while you're sleeping, and a lot of this has been explored. So the question is, where do dreams come from? Freud had a theory, and other people have had theories that I don't think are very good. But I think the most plausible biological theory of where dreams come from is a quite important psychological process called memory consolidation. So what goes on during sleep is lots of things. For one thing, your neurotransmitters are being replenished, and so the neurons work better. But another really important thing that happens during sleep is consolidation of memories. So during the day, lots of things happen to you. That is, you've got hundreds or thousands of experiences during the day, but most of them just aren't very important. So this morning I went for a walk, but it was the same walk that I do all the time. And so it would be really pointless if that went from my current experience into permanent memory, because there's no reason at all to believe all the details of the walk I took this morning, because it was just like hundreds of other walks that I've done. So while you're sleeping, this is not my theory. This is well-established psychological, neurological theory. While you're sleeping, your brain is basically selectively what to transfer from temporary memory into permanent memory. And the temporary memory is largely in an area of the brain called the hippocampus. And so the hippocampus has got these stored neural connections, and it needs to transfer into permanent memory, which is in the neocortex. And so the way it works is really quite clever, is it sort of refires a lot of things going in the hippocampus in interaction with the cortex, the neocortex. But the neocortex has lots of your old memories too, all your previous experiences. And it's by this interaction between what's going on in your daily experience and your long-term experience that decides which of your temporary experiences get translated into permanent memory. Now, the theory of dreaming that I find most plausible is that dreams are a side effect of that. That is because you've got all this neural processing going on, and neural processing tends to cause conscious experience. You're getting a lot of conscious experience as a result. It's not just a replay of the things during the day, although there could be part of that. And it's not just from your past experiences. It's the interaction of the two that go on. And this is why coherence is so important. Coherence is your brain trying to make sense of this weird jumble. What happened to me today? What's happened to me in the past? How do I make sense of this? Making sense here is a specific idea I talked about of satisfying a whole bunch of different constraints. And so the brain's trying to make sense of it. But the problem is that normally when we're getting around in the world, our experiences are very constrained by a constant array of sensory information, which you get from your eyes and your ears and your body and so on. But here there's no constraints because you're asleep. And so the brain gets really confused. It doesn't know how to make sense of that combination, but it's got this coherence engine built into it. So it tries to make sense. And that's when it generates dreams. Now, this can explain why dreams are often so weird. I mean, dreams often don't have any function. They're just bizarre, and they seem to contradict things that you normally see in the world. But if you put together coherence with neural representation, binding, and competition, you can explain why dreams have the strange properties that they tend to have. So what's going on here is not just saying, oh, you got these mechanisms that make dreams. We can explain specific things about dreams, such as their bizarre nature, that can be operating if our brain's coherence mechanism is trying, often in vain, to make sense of this weird combination that occurs between current memories and past memories that gets activated during memory consolidation. So here, it's a whole causal story. It's not just, well, you got the mechanisms working. No, it's saying it's memory consolidation, which is leading to the kinds of activations that the brain tries to make sense of. And the making sense of it results in our dream experiences, which occasionally can be sensible, but often are just quite bizarre.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I think I have to look into that a bit more, but yeah, and so you think that your approach here maybe gives an account of this that would be more difficult or not available on other approaches to consciousness, or? Yeah.
Right. So there are a lot of theories of consciousness out there, ranging from the philosophical ones like dualism and panpsychism, but there's also neuroscientific explanations. But they've all got various problems that I described in the last chapter of the book. But one of the big problems for all these theories, the philosophical and the neuroscientific, they don't just address why dreams are weird. I mean, why they're sometimes rich and complicated, and why they're highly emotional, and why they are sometimes just bizarre. So any theory, given that dreams are conscious experiences that everybody has, almost everybody has every night, then if your theory of consciousness can explain that, then it's an inadequate theory of consciousness. Here, by tying in with theories of dreams as connected with memory consolidation, these aren't my theories, these are well-established theories. By tying in with those, I'm able to connect the neural representations with these other processes that are quite well established and show this is where dreams come from. And so I'm giving a much more detailed account than any other theory of consciousness has even tried to do. Most people just tend to ignore dreams. But I've also done something else. And I think this is one of the things that's coolest about the book, is that by looking at dreams, jokes, and music from this new perspective, I think I've actually come up with a better account of the psychology of dreams and humor and music than the current available theories. So it's not just that I've plugged into existing theories, I've actually expanded them by showing that if you take current ideas for which there's empirical support and connect it with the four neural mechanisms for consciousness, you get a much better theory of dreams, humor, or music than has been available previously. So it's sort of funny that these areas are so important, but they've ignored consciousness, because mostly it's people who work on consciousness as one population, people who work on these things as another population. But by developing a theory of consciousness, I can actually come up with better theories of dreaming, humor, and music than have previously been available. And the same thing, I think, is true for sports experience and religious experience. So it turns out that the theory of consciousness is just really useful as a theory for these other sorts of things.
Right.
Would you like another example?
No, that's good. Well, I just could see someone saying that, all right, like if we're comparing this to some other approaches to consciousness, especially neurological approaches, maybe this is, an advantage to your theory, but it's not like, I don't know, I could see someone saying, I'm a global workspace theorist, and yeah, okay, I haven't offered an account of this, but that could just be a further development of global workspace theory, or that applied to a specific case, that maybe we could have a theory of it. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I've got two responses to that. The global workspace theory says that consciousness is a kind of broadcasting. So you've got something going on in one part of the brain, but it's sufficiently important that it gets broadcast to other parts of the brain. So global workspace is where all this gets put together. And it's been advocated by some very serious people. I think that Dahain is really, really a strong theorist. But it's got two major problems. First of all, you say, well, you could easily expand it. Well, but could you? You could say that, but then you got to do it. That is, you've got to show that you've got enough mechanistic power in what you've described to get to dreams. You've got to show how it connects up, for example, with memory consolidation. But there's another problem with global workspace theory. This is the big problem. It explicitly disavows explaining experience. They say, oh, we're not trying to explain experience. That's sort of philosophical. No, that's not philosophical. That's as bad as the illusionists. It's saying, oh, we're going to ignore what's most fundamental about consciousness, namely that we have these experiences. It's like saying, we're going to explain emotions, but forget about feelings. Feelings isn't, of course, feelings are important. They're absolutely central to human experience and human psychology. So global workspace theory specifically says that they're not trying to explain qualitative experience. That seems to me to completely exclude it as a reasonable theory of consciousness. That's just hopeless. Whereas I try to show in some detail where different kinds of experiences come from through the interaction of neural representation and binding and coherence and competition. So it's just not a very good theory. I mean, it was put together by some very smart people and has some impressive pieces of evidence for it, but it's not nearly a strong enough theory to be able to say that it's a conscious theory of consciousness that can be extended to dreaming or anything else.
Yeah, good. And then I don't know if you want to talk about any others like a integrated information theory, or I know you talk about these in the book, but if you want to give some brief remarks. I mean, is there any other approaches that you think are potentially promising, or what do you think?
Well, I picked any kind of scientific reasoning. It can't be saying, here's my theory and it's mine, so it's right. I mean, that doesn't go. My arguments are not at all a priori. It's empirical. It's saying, looking at all the available evidence and considering the range of explanatory power, my theory is better than those other ones. And so it has to be comparative. That's why I had the last chapter where I explicitly compare the theory, which seem to be the three best neuroscientific theories, which is information integration, which you mentioned, global workspace, and predictive processing. And for each one, I was able to show they just don't have the kinds of explanatory power. They also have internal different difficulties. For information integration, I like the metaphor of information integration. That's a great metaphor. And in fact, that's what binding is about. It's about information integration. So that's perfectly fine. But the way they explain information integration is in terms of a magic formula that's supposed to capture how the brain does it. Well, the magic formula is nonsense. I mean, it's computationally intractable. I showed this in a paper I published in 2014, where because I've got a good background in computer science, when I first read about information integration theory, I thought, well, let me figure out how to compute this. Let me turn this into a computer program. And I immediately realized that the computation that goes into information integration requires calculating the subsets, all the sets of subsets of a set of occurrences in the world. Well, anyone who knows combinatorics knows that explodes computationally, explodes exponentially. And any exponential process can't be done in a brain, it can't be done in a computer. And in fact, they wrote a computer program for doing information integration. It could only apply to 12 examples. And that's because once you start to get 2 to the 12th, 2 to the 100th, and so on, it all becomes just impossible. So computationally, information integration theory just is a failure. And basically, what do they rely on? They've got some very strange things they call axioms, which are extremely vague. So I think it's actually not a good scientific theory. So I think it's got internal problems, and it doesn't have the range of explanation that I've got, because I don't think you can give an information integration theory of dreams and jokes and songs, for example. So these are three that I picked as the best. I think these are the three best, but I also mentioned 10 others that have got inadequacies on their own and different sorts of problems with them. So there's lots of theories around there. There are probably 100 different theories of consciousness out there. And the reason is it's such an important phenomena that it's good that there's a proliferation of theories. But what you have to do is to figure out, among all the theories, which is the best with respect to explaining the broadest range of phenomena in ways that are scientifically plausible. So you've got to have mechanisms that are plausible, and you've got to have an immense range of explanatory power. And I think my NB theory of consciousness has that.
Yeah, fair enough. I do want to, I mean, we can always cover more examples or more theories here, but I do want to cover a couple of things that come up in the book. One being, well, you talk a little bit about, or at some length about different ways you might apply this theory. One is to thinking about animal consciousness, which is a big topic. And, well, I don't know if you want to comment on that briefly. How do you think what could we learn about animals from given this approach?
In this book, in Dreams, Jokes, and Songs, I was fairly brief about animals because I wrote about them a lot in an earlier book called Bots and Beasts that came out in 2021. I really just did an update here, and I actually changed my mind about some things, because if you look at behavioral and theoretical reasons for ascribing consciousness, actually, this is an area where my views changed a lot over the years. I wasn't sure at all when I started working on Bots and Beasts whether cats and dogs are conscious, whether they have emotions or so on. But I became convinced while writing that, yes, they do. But of course, a lot of people want to expand beyond that. They say, well, it's not just cats and dogs and mammals that are like us, it's also birds. And I looked at, I thought the behavioral and theoretical evidence suggests that they're probably conscious too. They probably have maybe not abstract thoughts, but definitely emotions and sensations and perceptions. But people have wanted to extend it beyond that. And in this book, in the new book, I became convinced by recent evidence that, it probably extends to fish and crabs too, at least for simple things like pain. But other people want to expand it even farther, and they say, oh no, but trees and plants and bacteria have consciousness as well. There I draw the line. Say, if you look at behavioral evidence for consciousness, and if you look at the theoretical basis for consciousness, both behaviorally and theoretically, there's no reason at all to suppose that every cell or every bacterium or every plant or every tree has consciousness. They do a lot of signaling, but that's not consciousness. So I think that this is one way in which a theory can be useful. This doesn't support the theory. You've got to have other evidence for the theory. But if you've got a good theory of consciousness, then you can start to say more plausibly whether these other things are consciousness. So I think that are conscious. So I think that the dogs and cats and birds and maybe even fish and crabs have these mechanisms. They certainly have neural representations. They certainly have binding. They probably have coherence and some kind of competition. So based on that, it seems at least worth considering that they've got it. But if you look at trees and bacteria and cells, and if you even farther into panpsychism to things like rocks, no, they don't have any such mechanisms, and they don't have any kind of behavior. So we can say with a high degree of a high degree of confidence that they don't have consciousness.
Right. I mean, what about things like, I don't know, like a fly or like a shrimp? I mean,
Yeah, well, there it gets tricky because you get fewer neurons. So I actually got convinced, since I wrote Bots and Beasts, there I was sort of agnostic about bees. But bees have got very complex behaviors, and they've got pretty big brains. They got 1 million neurons. So a fly only has about 100,000 neurons and not nearly as complex behaviors as bees do. Because if you look at, for example, the communications of bees that signal to other bees where honey could be found. So bees are behaviorally and neurologically more complicated. And I got convinced by a leading brain researcher that, yeah, there's probably good reason to think that bees might have a little bit of consciousness as well, but probably not flies because their behaviors are not so complicated. Shrimp have, I think, very small brains, small number of neurons, not very complex behaviors. So I don't think they've got consciousness.
Fair enough. Do you think, I actually did want to ask briefly about this. Do you think there can be some degree of vagueness or indeterminacy into whether something has consciousness? I mean, because I think about these conditions and it's like, well, there could be sort of potentially borderline cases about whether something really counts as having those to the sufficient degree, if that makes sense. So, I mean, what do you think about that?
Yeah. Sure. In the border cases, there's lots of uncertainty, and we should simply admit it, which I did. And so I'm certain that humans have consciousness because we have both the theoretical and the behavioral evidence for it. Probably dogs and cats, but once you get into bees and crabs, I can take a guess, but it's just a guess. I don't have a lot of confidence there.
Right. No, but I suppose also it's maybe not just a matter of epistemology, because like you might think that, well, if these are the conditions required for consciousness and they're actually admitted borderline cases, then maybe there are just actually borderline cases about whether, not just a matter of, well, we don't know. It's just like, maybe there's even no fact of the matter. I mean, yeah.
But it's important to know that consciousness isn't an all or nothing thing. It comes in degrees. So, for example, consider the most advanced kind of consciousness. We have self-consciousness. We're aware of ourselves. So this is a big part of human experience. We're probably sometimes too more aware of ourselves than we want to be. So that's certainly true with complex emotions. But we've got these representations of ourselves that other animals don't. So if you look at something like a mirror test, can the animal recognize themselves in a mirror? And there's at least 10 or 12 different species of animals that can do that, but not all. And so it's not clear that once you go beyond big brains of the sort that humans and primates have and a few other animals like elephants, that there can be something like self-consciousness. So I think that there's a different degree there. So if you go down to a crab, there's pretty good evidence that's been accumulated that they experience pain, but maybe that's pretty much all they experience, because you can see that biologically pain is a really useful thing because it gets you away from noxious experiences. So crabs maybe have pain, maybe they have simple visual experiences. I don't think they have a lot of guilt or shame or other things that require representation of the self. So there's different degrees here. So it's not just saying maybe they're a little bit conscious. It's rather should be able to specify that they could have consciousness of some basic things like pain or maybe hunger, but not the full range of conscious experience that humans have. So there's uncertainty, not just over the binary question, are they conscious or not? There's uncertainty about which kinds of consciousness do they actually have.
Right. And then let's see. Well, I was also going to ask about like artificial intelligence, because I know you talk about that in the book, and sort of also leading into that. I mean, we might question, because someone hearing your approach here might think, well, is this just a sort of functionalism? And you talk about how that's not quite right, because it's not entirely substrate independent. So I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit, and then about AI and how you approach that. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. So I figured I needed to pick up on the arguments I made in Bots and Beast in 2021. But of course, science advances. And one of the most astonishing things that's happened in the last 5 years, maybe the last century, is the development of ChatGPT. So when that came out in November 2022, I was astonished because I just published this book that said artificial intelligence capable of advanced language processing is probably decades or centuries away. Whoa, I was off by decades or centuries, because ChatGPT was astonishing because I could interact with it. I could ask it really complicated questions and it would come up with often reasonable answers. It made stupid mistakes sometimes, but often it really knew what it was talking about. And so that was a giant change. And actually that made me change my philosophy of mind, because in previous works, I've argued for some version of the identity theory that basically says mind is brain, or filling it out, mental processes are neural processes. Loads of evidence for that. But I also said, and this is in my 2019 books, that, well, I might have to change that if AI turns out to be capable of intelligence. Well, suddenly there was ChatGPT that I think is capable of intelligence. In fact, I'm now just finishing a book to be published by MIT Press that is a much more comprehensive review of the new artificial intelligence, which I think is really powerful. There's things it can't do very well yet, but it does a lot of things extraordinarily well. It's very good at scientific reasoning. It's very good at philosophical reasoning too. I'm shocked at questions I can ask it and get really, really good answers in both philosophy and science. So I think it's intelligent. I don't think it's as intelligent as us yet, but it's getting there. So what does that do to the philosophy of mind? Well, it's a big problem for the mind-body identity theory, which I'd always adopted before, along with lots of other people, because suddenly, instead of just being able to say that intelligence is a brain process, but wait a minute, now it's in computers. Does that mean I should switch over to functionalism? So let me review what functionalism is. Functionalism is the view that hardware doesn't matter, that intelligence and all the other mental properties are just a matter of input-output and computational operations on them. This view has been really popular in philosophy since the 60s and 70s. People like Hilary Putnam and Jerry Fodor brought it in and argued for it. And it made sense at the time because computers had arrived and artificial intelligence had arrived, and it seemed that we should be able to do what people do just by computational operations. And people like Putnam and Fodor drew the conclusion that the hardware doesn't matter. So it's just all computation, whether it's done by brains or computers or by paper clips, it's still all computation. But I was skeptical of that starting in the 80s, because in the 80s, when neural networks came along, we started to see that parallelism matters. That is, it really does matter that the brain is a parallel processor, that you've got these 86 billion rather slow operators, but there's a lot of them and they're operating in parallel. So way back in the mid-80s, I published a paper called Parallel Computation and the Mind-Body Problem, arguing against functionalism, that functionalism sounded plausible in the 60s and 70s, but by the 80s, when people were realizing that neural networks really were a special kind of hardware, both in our brains and in the computers, that it mattered. Well, let's move it up to now. So you might think that we've got all these powerful computational models, and so it shows that all you need is computation. All that matters is the computational function, so we can ignore the hardware. But when I started looking into how these systems actually work, I realized, no, the hardware is really important. Can you run ChatGPT on your little laptop? Well, no, you can't, because it takes too much computation. How are they run? They're run in data centers with hundreds of thousands of NVIDIA processors. And what are the NVIDIA processors? Are they just like the chip in your computer? No, they're not. They're special. They're graphic processing units. Now, NVIDIA originally developed these GPUs to run for gaming, because you needed to do a lot of very fast kinds of calculations for the games to work and have video displays. But people who developed deep learning, and this is a relatively recent development, this is in the early 2010s, realized, first of all, that deep learning required huge amounts of computation. It was a kind of neural network learning that was really powerful, but really computationally heavy. But they also got the idea that if they use GPUs, these graphic program units from gaming, they could get much better systems. So NVIDIA now is the biggest company in the world. It's worth trillions of dollars. Why did this happen? It didn't happen because of gaming, because people realize it's crucial for artificial intelligence. Why? Because unless you've got these vast numbers of extremely fast chips running on special hardware that's good for doing the calculations that are needed for building the neural networks in the new computers, it would just be too slow. Right now, ChatGPT is being used by 700 million people per week. And that's almost a tenth of the world's population. It wouldn't be able to do this without the particular kinds of NVIDIA chips or similar ones that are produced by Amazon or Google. So the chip matters, the hardware matters. So I realized by the time I was finished the book that I needed a new philosophy of mind. That is, that dualism and the kind of non-scientific ideas are hopeless, but that the standard way that I like to do it, mind-brain identity theory, doesn't work anymore because we've got these intelligent machines. But that doesn't switch us over to functionalism, because if you actually look at the way that these AI systems work, the hardware matters a lot. It matters for reasons of speed. It matters for reasons of power. It matters for reasons of history. It matters for reasons of space. The hardware really matters. The kind of hardware we've got right here is really special. And it's certainly got big advantages over these data centers, which take up vast amounts of electricity and require whole power plants for themselves. Here, our brain runs on about 40 watts. I mean, it's like a small light bulb. So it's very efficient with respect to energy, with respect to space, with respect to time, with respect to the history of how it evolved. So what I did at the end of the book is come up with what I think is a new philosophy of mind, that is a new solution to the mind-body problem that seems to me to fit both what we know about the way our brains work, but also fit really well with these wonderful new developments in artificial intelligence, where hardware still matters, even though the hardware is really different from the hardware that makes our brains work.
Right. Could someone just say, though, that the hardware matters to the extent that it's the sort of hardware that could realize the relevant sorts of functions, and then just it's got to be more than that.
No, that's not enough. It's not just a matter of realizing the functions. You've got to realize the functions in a way that's fast enough and conserves energy enough and doesn't consume too much space and is realizable given the history you've got. So I call this version coherent materialism. So here I'm using coherent in my technical sense. Coherent here means satisfying constraints. And I argue, partly based on other work that I've done, that the four major constraints for getting a hardware-software combination are the speed, because if you can't do it fast enough and you're a biological system, you're going to get eaten and you're not going to manage to reproduce. But you also need energy. So energy is really important. This is something that's been completely neglected by people discussing about functionalism, because they just ignored it. But it's crucial to have energy. If you don't have energy coming in, you can't keep a brain running and you can't keep a data center running these AI systems. So energy is crucial. And of course, space is really important if you're a biological system and you've got to have a brain small enough that it can fit through a pelvis. So you've got all these different constraints, and you've got to be able to take the technology or the biology you've got and use the history to get somewhere new. So these are four fundamental constraints that show that the idea that any hardware can run on any software can run any hardware, it's just not true if you want to satisfy these constraints. So getting a good fit between hardware and software is a constraint satisfaction problem. That is, it's a coherence problem. So that's why I call this view coherent materialism, or I wanted something shorter, I call it co-materialism. So I think this is a new version of materialism that overcomes the problem with both the mind-brain identity theory, but also with the functionalist theory that's been probably the most dominant view in the philosophy of mind. So I think it's kind of fun that combination of a new theory of consciousness and figure out how it applies to the new way of doing artificial intelligence that's exploded only in the last 3 years has pointed toward a different solution to the mind-body problem.
Yeah, I like it a lot. I mean, what about the case where if someone posits imagine, yeah, okay, so for stuff on our environment and our evolutionary history, obviously there's certain constraints that you talk about, but like, I don't know, I could imagine something that's not subject to those sorts of constraints or subject to different sorts of constraints, or like, what if there was just like a Boltzmann brain in the void, but it was like much larger and the brain processes were much slower, but otherwise it was like did the same things that our brains do, at least inside the brain. Would that still be conscious or no?
Well, you can imagine that.
Yeah.
Well, you can imagine that, but imagination is really limited. I can imagine something made of hydrogen and oxygen that's just like it isn't like water at all, or that something that isn't hydrogen. Well, imagination is a very unreliable method here because our imagination is always restricted by what we know or what we want to know. So, yeah, you could tell those stories, but those are just stories. What we want instead is to look at evidence, look at explanations, look for the best explanations. And that gives us a much better approach than simply imagining what might be true, where our imagination is affected more by our prejudices than by evidence and explanation, which is what I want to go by.
Fair enough. And then, but like, what about cases where, I don't know, it's a kind of twin Earth. It's something very similar to Earth, except that instead of carbon-based life, it's like silicon-based. Would that still be okay? Or like, what do you think?
Look, you've got it. You're using the standard philosophical method of thought experiments. And actually, I've written a lot about this. So I've written a paper called Thought Experiments Considered Harmful. And I've written about this other places as well. So the idea that you should be able to reach philosophical conclusions based on thought experiments goes back to Plato. I mean, you should be able to figure things from pure thought. But I think Aristotle had a much better approach. He was much more empirical. He wanted to see what's happening in the world with respect to biology and physics and so on. So here, it's disastrous because you think, oh, I'll tell a little story and I'll pump my intuitions and that'll show that this theory is wrong. Well, that's just not a reliable way to proceed. It's kind of like reading Donald Trump's tweets or religious texts. It's just not a reliable way of going. And so for each thought experiment, there's an equal and opposite thought experiment. In fact, I just realized something about the new AI that I think completely undercuts this. If you use ChatGPT or one of the other systems.
Yeah, I like ChatGPT.
Yeah, so ask it, give me pick some philosophical issue that you're interested in. It could be an ethical issue. I use basic income. Should there be a basic universal income? Give me 20 thought experiments in favor of it and 20 thought experiments against it. And in a second, it'll do it. So these systems are really good at generating thought experiments. But what the thought experiments do is just enforce your own prejudices. So I think as a general methodological point, this is just the wrong way to go. And then you can look at particular examples. And so that, well, yeah, sure, you think you can imagine something that's just like the brain, but doesn't have consciousness. That's the zombie argument. But what's your imagination based on? It's just based on ignorance. It's based on the sort of thing to go, well, I can imagine water that wasn't made of H2O. Sure, you can do that. But the evidence and the explanations show that it is. So I think that the thought experiments are a worthless methodology in general. And they're particularly worthless for making judgments about explanatory identities.
Right. I was going to, if you were okay taking a couple of questions like this, I was going to ask about, well, since you're sort of materialist here, what do you think about some of the kind of standard objections or arguments against materialism? So like, I don't know, you mentioned there's a kind of zombie argument right there, but what do you think about although he doesn't endorse this argument anymore, Frank Jackson's kind of Mary's room thought experiment. Like, I'm not going to give a rendition of it now. Well,
they all have the same problem. The general problem is this is a horrible methodology because you can't expect to learn anything this way. And the particular ones, you can look at it and say, well, is that actually really reasonable? I mean, could it actually be the case that Mary knows something different as a result of suddenly getting her sight restored? There's another way to say, well, My intuition is, well, that actually couldn't work. The story is incoherent because it's incoherent with what we know about how the brain works. And someone could say, well, that's not my intuition. Well, let's stop arguing about intuitions. Battling intuitions is something that philosophers do, and I think it's just a waste of time. You don't make any progress that way. You basically just reinforce your own prejudices. What you should do instead is, well, let's not look at stories, let's look at the evidence. Let's look at what has been found over the last 100 years in neuroscience about the operations of the visual system. And you pick up any textbook and you find vast amounts of knowledge that's tied in with explanations that come about through computational models in the field of theoretical neuroscience. It's not done. There's vast amounts still to be learned, but loads of progress has been made that way. And you think that you can put block to that progress just by telling a little story is a kind of philosophical arrogance that should have expired a long time ago.
Fair enough. Yeah, I mean, I want to say for the Mary Zoom thought experiment is that depending on how like physical information is construed, either, well, the setup is incoherent because she would, you're restricting her from having certain physical information in the room, or it's what she learns, so to speak, is just a different way of describing something she already could have described in the room, certain brain processes and so on. To maybe develop some new, mental terminology for referring to those same things, but it's not like she, anything was added to her ontology. It was all there to begin with. It's just under a different description or something like that.
Or more importantly, I think I want to ask, what about Mary's experience can we explain? Can we explain her blindness? Can we explain suddenly she can see colors? How does the color vision work? And there's actually good explanations for all those things that are based on the neuroscience rather than on a story that's supposed to support some kind of dualism.
Right. And then, yeah. So you mentioned this a little bit already, and passing here or there, but what do you think are some areas where this might be developed further, or like further research might be needed? I mean,
all of these areas are wide open. I mean, there's, as I suggested, I don't think that the NBC theory of consciousness is the end of the story. I mean, there's loads and loads of details. We need to know more about perception and sensation, but especially about emotions. Emotions are really complicated and they're really central to the human experience. So there's loads of work to be done there. And the abstract questions about the sense of self. So I actually end the book with half a dozen research programs. So there's just lots of work to be done. I'd like to have more empirical evidence for my theory. I think it's a plausible theory because it's got such broad explanatory power. But there's lots of really detailed questions about how music works, how dreams work, how humor works that could be explored using this as a theoretical framework. So the advantage of good theory is not just what it explains, but how it leads to new research. And so I'm hoping that there'll be that kind of empirical research. There's also loads of room for philosophical developments, because I think philosophy hasn't been rendered obsolete by cognitive science and neuroscience. In fact, it has really valuable roles. I published a paper a long time ago called Why Cognitive Science Needs Philosophy and Vice Versa. I think philosophy is really valuable because it asks questions that are more general and more normative than science does. The generality comes in when you ask questions, not just how does sensation work or how does perception work, but how does the mind work in general? I think that's where coming up with a philosophy of mind like coherent materialism is really valuable. So there's lots to be done there. With respect to computational modeling, well, there's lots to be done there. So I developed computational models of neural representation using other people's ideas and binding and competition. But independent from that, I've developed computational models of coherence, but I've never put them together. Why? Because I'm busy writing books rather than writing programs these days. And so that would be really good to see if it actually works. One of the great things about computational modeling isn't just that it works. Sometimes it fails. Sometimes ideas you think should fit together don't, and you discover that by writing the program and discovering it's got inherent problems, such as combinatorial explosions. So there's loads of work to be done in neuroscience and psychology and philosophy and computer modeling that will, I hope, go on for decades or centuries if the AI doesn't kill us first.
Fair enough. And one thing you did mention there, because I normally end with a more general metaphilosophical question about the value of philosophy. You mentioned a couple of things to that effect there, but I don't know. Do you want to comment on that a little bit more? Like, what do you think is the value of philosophy?
Sure. I actually, since you're a philosophy blog, I think that's really appropriate. I mean, some people, when I first started doing computer models and working with psychologists, so people ask me, Paul, why are you giving up philosophy? And I said, I'm not giving up philosophy. I'm just looking for better ways to do it. That is, I'm still concerned today with all the epistemological and metaphysical, and especially the ethical questions that I was worried about when I began philosophy many decades ago. And all those questions are still live. And so there's been big advances in all the scientific fields here and in the computational fields. But that just makes the philosophical questions more pressing. So my new book, the one I'm finishing up right now for MIT Press, I keep changing the title, but the current title is Doom or Boom: Philosophy and Psychology of the New Artificial Intelligence. The philosophical questions are really important because this is a great development in science. It's got all sorts of ethical problems about how to use these systems. It's got even aesthetic problems about what happens when you've got art created by computers. It's got metaphysical questions such as the nature of the mind-body problem that I talked about before, and epistemological questions about whether these new machines actually know something when it seems like they can spit out things that are incredibly intelligent, but they also make a lot of mistakes. So it's not that philosophy is made obsolete by all these scientific developments. It just gets way more interesting than it ever was possible to be before. So I don't see any eclipse of philosophy by the scientific developments. And I think that the people who don't think they need philosophy when they're pursuing philosophical questions are just ignorant. They don't realize that they're just doing bad philosophy based on people that they haven't even read, when these issues are in fact very huge in the enterprises that they're considering.
Great. I think this is going to be a good place to end off, if that's fine with you. I do want to. I'm also going to include links to where people can find this book in the description. I think it's going to be on Amazon too. It's at least on Oxford University Press.
It's already available on Kindle.
Right.
The Kindle, but the hardcover won't be available in North America until.
Right, but I think it'll be on OUP, but maybe also on Amazon as well. Not sure, but maybe other places. But I'll include some links where people can find it. But anyway, thanks so much, Professor Thagard, for doing this and writing this book and taking my questions and giving your responses. It's been really great having you.
Oh, thanks a lot for the great questions.